Welcome everyone to the first of our new Experts and Insights series that we're introducing this year. Today's session is called Maintaining a Healthy Brain. How do we learn, forget, and relearn as we age? I have the esteemed pleasure of being joined by Dr. Lara Boyd from the University of British Columbia. Dr. Boyd is going to talk to us about what we can do to facilitate learning and how we can leverage that information to maintain a healthy brain as we age. I'm also joined by my co-host, Senior Planet Program Tech Trainer, Johnny Hernandez. And he's going to be leading a special insight segment towards the end of the session where he'll be talking to you about learning apps. So stick around, you're not going to want to miss it. Today's expert, Dr. Lara Boyd, is a physical therapist and neuroscientist at the University of British Columbia, where she's a professor, distinguished university scholar, and fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. She is an expert in the neurobiology of learning and uses advanced brain imaging approaches to look into the brain. Dr. Boyd's research is centered on understanding how behavior shapes learning, unlearning, and relearning. She has published more than 200 scientific papers, and her TED Talk, After This, Your Brain Will Not Be the Same, has over 38 million views. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lara Boyd.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's exciting to see so many people interested in brain and brain health. So we'll just get started from there. I hope it's not just because the weather where you are is as terrible as our weather is here and you didn't have anything else to do. So regardless, we will try to make it worth everyone's time. Okay, let me just start this up. Fabulous. All right. So I'm going to speak for about 35 minutes, maybe 40 if I get excited this morning, and then I'll be happy to stay around and answer any questions. I'll also invite you. Sometimes we think of things afterwards or we're kind of, considering the information. You might have something I talk about that you want more information on. And so you are always welcome to reach out to me via email, and my email address is here at the University of British Columbia, or I'm actually quite easy to find online if you want to take a look at my website or have a look at that TED Talk if you're not one of the bazillions of people who've already seen it, which is frankly a little bit creepy, but also kind of exciting, to be honest. So today I'm going to start by really talking about how do we learn. The reason I do this in the context of brain health is twofold. One, the process for learning is very similar to the process for looking at brain change, or what we call neuroplasticity. And so the reason that that's important to you this morning or this afternoon, depending where you are, is that learning actually is changing the brain. And this is one of the main ways that we can maintain brain health well into our old age. So every time you learn a new fact, or you learn a new skill, or perhaps you are learning or relearning something after your brain has been damaged, that change in your behavior is being supported by change in your brain. And it turns out that our brains are basically constantly reorganizing themselves. They start doing this basically the moment we're born, and as far as we know, that continues until the moment that we die. And so our brains, we now understand, are these incredibly dynamic structures in our body, and that they're basically accommodating any information that they're receiving from the environment. So when I talk about neuroplasticity, I'm talking about this capacity for the brain to change and the fact that it's doing it all the time. And in fact, you're doing it right now. And one of my very favorite things to say is that when you're done with this talk, when you stand up and you walk out of the room that you're sitting in or you're standing in right now, your brain will be different than it was when you started the day. And that's actually one of the most important things you can do to maintain your brain health. So I'll give you a well done already to all of us for being here and learning something new today. So one of the neat things about brain change is that the most significant thing that changes is our behavior. And so the adaptive capacity of the brain, we understand, is most significantly changed by what we do with our time. So there's no drug that we take that drives neural reorganization. You notice we didn't all get up and take a neuroplasticity drug this morning. And there are other interventions that try to shape or facilitate neuroplasticity, things like brain stimulation or exercise. These things do change and positively affect the brain, but behavior seems to be the major driver of brain change. Now, with that said, I think it's also for us to keep in mind that our brain is changing just depending upon whatever we're doing, whatever we're interacting with, whatever we're paying attention to. So that means that neuroplasticity can be positive. You learn something new, you improved your golf swing, you had a really happy, wonderful experience. But neuroplasticity can also be negative. We can have post-traumatic stress, we can have pain, we could be addicted to drugs. And so neuroplasticity is kind of it's nonpartisan. It changes based upon what you're doing. It doesn't always changing in a good way. And neuroplasticity is not always a good thing. What we want to talk about is positive brain change, and changing our brain in a way that makes us healthier and more able to do the things that we're interested in doing. So I want to spend about the first maybe, I don't know, quarter of the talk just talking about the specifics of how does our brain change. I think this is fascinating, and I think it's really important to share with you that this is a really dynamic field of research. So what I tell you today could be totally different in 2 weeks because there's so much information coming out about the brain. It's happening so rapidly. And this has really been a field that's been facilitated by a lot of advanced techniques in research that have been really exciting. So for example, my career has really benefited from the advent of having an MRI machine. So having a magnetic resonance imaging machine or scanner allows me to actually look inside the human brain and watch it actually change as we're interacting with it, as we're having patients or study participants engage in different behaviors. And so watch the space because it's going to change very, very quickly in the next few years, I'm sure. So when we learn something new or we change our brain, we're going to see changes in really 3 main systems in the brain. So we're going to change our brain chemistry, we're going to change our brain structure, and we'll change our brain function. And all of these things are happening together. And it's interesting to think about how and when they happen, what stimulates them to happen, because that explains why sometimes things are easier or harder to actually learn. So this beautiful picture I have on the side here, this is an image of actual brain cells. These are called neurons. And in the brain, a lot of our neurons look a lot like big trees, in my opinion. So we have these kind of big root systems. This would be the cell body, the kind of the main part of the neuron itself. And then from that, you have projections coming off. We have these long, long structures coming off to the side. That's what we would call an axon. And basically, you could think of that as the tree trunk. And it's a long way that that neuron is able to connect with another neuron someplace else, either in the brain or maybe in the spinal cord. You can think about this as kind of like a superhighway for information. We also have coming off this cell body, these little guys. They look like little hairs. I think of them as like the branches on a tree. Now, these little guys are called dendrites, and what they are the branches that are sending information from one individual brain cell to the next individual brain cell. So this is how the cells are communicating with one another across and through the brain. And why these cells are important is because they can rapidly change. So these long dendrites, these kind of branches of the tree, they can very rapidly increase or decrease in number. They can also increase or decrease the numbers of contacts they have with other nerve cells nearby. So this is one of the basic tenets of neuroplasticity. Let's move on and let's just think a little bit about how these might interact and how brain chemistry is important for learning. So the way that these cells are talking to one another is not by actually touching, and it's not through electricity, it's actually through sending small packets of chemicals from one cell to the next. That's called a neurotransmitter. And so these branches come very, very close to one another. They don't quite touch. And then to communicate, little bits of chemicals are going back and forth between them. So the reason why that's important for learning is because the concentration of these chemicals can change really quickly in the brain. And we think that this is the basis for short-term memory formation. So a short-term memory is a memory that you can make very quickly. It usually has a limited amount of information that goes into it. So this is typically we can remember about 7 things at a time in terms of a list. And that's a fundamental kind of issue around this short-term memory. So we can rapidly change the chemical concentration. and these synaptic clefts in the areas between the neurons. And then that's going to allow us to form a short-term memory. Now, a short-term memory is just that. It may or may not be helpful later on. And so in order to take that short-term memory that's supported by chemistry and put it into a long-term memory, we're going to have to take that chemical change and make it into a structural change. So I want to show you really quickly, this is an example of some of my MRI imaging work. We can actually image different chemicals in the brain through something called magnetic structural resonance imaging. And in doing so, we can look at the changes of chemical concentrations in small regions in the brain. And so this is just an example. This is one of the individuals who we've studied in my lab. It's someone who's had a stroke. And so this is as if you slice the front of my head off and you're looking straight in. This would be the area of stroke, this white area here. And what we've done here is we're looking to see whether or not a chemical, which we call NAA, which tells us about brain health, or a different chemical called glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter, whether or not those chemical concentrations are shifted by stroke severity, by how severely affected the brain was by that stroke. And we do find, for example, that the brain is less excitable. We see less glutamate in the damaged side of the brain and in individuals with much more severe stroke. This is a way that we can look at chemical concentration change actually in the human brain as people are learning and changing. Okay, so we have a short-term memory, we've changed our brain chemistry. Now in order to have that be a long-term memory, something I can remember later on, something I can come back to at a different place at a different time, we're going to actually have to change the structure of the brain. Now, brain structure changes in lots of ways. The first way, the simplest way, is that we can increase or decrease the numbers of these branches off the tree. So we can have more of those dendrites or less of those dendrites. The second way that our brains can change is we can have a change in the amount of thickness of these long axon projections. That happens by changing the amount of insulation around them. It's called myelin. And when we do that, those impulses can travel faster or slower. So we can speed up or slow down basically the traffic in the brain. And that's another way that brain structure can change. The last way that brain structure can change is by changing the size of an area of the brain. So the amount of the brain that's devoted to a certain ability. So I bet some of you online here listening today are musicians. And so congratulations, because you guys have special brains. So musicians will have practiced so much that the area of their brain devoted to their musical skill will actually be enlarged. So an example of that would be if any of you are violin players, your fingering hand has a much larger representation in the brain than your hand that you bow with. Or if you're a pianist, you just have a funky brain because you learned basically and trained your brain to be able to disassociate one side from the other, so your hands can do two very complicated things at the same time. And you'll see larger hand representations in your brain for those individuals. Not to fear if you're not a musician. I'm not. I live with musicians and I love them and enjoy them, but I have actually no musical talent. Those of us who have really good spatial navigation, so those of us who don't get lost, who can remember maps in our heads, the brain region devoted to spatial orientation, which would be our right hippocampus, will be bigger than our left one. So we see these shifts based upon our behavior and our brain structure. So I'm showing you here just an image of how we can start to look at kind of this wiring in a human brain. So this is my brain. I think it's really pretty, and I don't think it's pretty because it's my brain. Your brain would be beautiful also. And what this is basically is a wiring diagram of my brain. It's called a diffusion tensor image. It's showing you every single connection between different brain regions to the resolution of my MRI scanner at UBC, and how the brain's all connected and how wired. So every single one of these little lines is actually a reflection of a structural connection between brain regions. The colors are telling us the direction of those connections. So this would be this coming down into the spinal cord at the base of the brain, so it's up and down. This image, if you're looking straight at my head, is what you would be looking at. So this big red bundle here, this is called the corpus callosum. It's connecting the sides of my brain. And then so red is side to side, blue is up and down, green is front to back. And then of course the in-between colors, the purples and the pinks, are things kind of moving off axis. But I just want you to have a sense of the complexity of the connectivity in our brain. It's magnificent and it's crazy. So let me give you a quick example of how chemical change and structural change interact. So have you ever been trying to learn something new? Let's say you're actually a musician and you've been practicing a certain part of a particular piece and you're practicing, and you've got it, like you can do it. You've nailed it, you've gotten it down. And you come back the next day and you don't have it. And you had it, you could do it yesterday. And today's so frustrating because now you can't play that particular piece and you have to kind of start back over and re-practice and get it back. So that's a lovely example of, in that first instance, in that first practice session, you altered the chemistry of your brain and you were able to perform the piece. But for whatever reason, you weren't able to create that short-term memory, transform it into a long-term memory so that you could do it later. Maybe it was really hard and you just need more practice. You have to come back and practice again and again and again. And so changing brain structure takes time. It probably also takes sleep. So converting a short-term memory to a long-term memory takes time and sleep. We're going to talk about sleep more at the end of today, at the end of this talk. So I'm going to put a kind of a pin in that, but it turns out that that's a really important piece of this ability to change our brain. Okay, and then lastly, our brain function changes when we're learning, when we're changing. And so this can change in lots of ways. Basically here I'm just talking about how brain regions are turning on, the amount that they have to turn on to support a skill. And so here's a couple ways we can look at that with our MRI in humans. The first one is we have people perform tasks in the MRI and we look to see how patterns of activity are changing. And that's what I'm showing over here. This other piece is something I just want to make sure everyone's aware of. We can actually image the human brain at rest. And the activity that we see is a reflection of what that person has recently done or practiced or experienced. And so this is called resting state fMRI, resting state functional MRI. And from this type of work, we have realized that the human brain is never actually at rest. So even when you're seemingly doing nothing, seemingly thinking about nothing, the brain is highly active. And when we think we're doing nothing, when we're kind of zoned out, we're not really paying attention, our brain actually goes to a very stereotypic pattern of activity. We call it default mode network. But that kind of resting state, that kind of default mode network activity, it's when we're not on task. That actually turns out we're now thinking is very healthy for the brain. It's actually good for the brain to take a few breaks through the day to just kind of reset, shut down for a moment, go to default, and then come back into a task itself. And so all of you are going to do that at some point during this talk today, or maybe during the next part of the session, where all of a sudden you'll realize, oh, I zoned out. I wasn't listening just for a moment. And that's because your brain has gone to a resting state and it's gone to default. And that's okay. So I'm not offended. You don't have to tell me, but we're all going to do it at some point today. Okay, so your brain is highly neuroplastic. All of our brains are neuroplastic. And what's important about this neuroplasticity is it doesn't change with age. We're good at it when we're young. We're good at it when we're old. When we're really young, we're actually really, really good at it. Not quite as good as we are now as we're aging. But there's something really very, very special about a child's brain and how capable they are at learning new things, learning new movement, learning new languages. But we're not so bad as we get older either. So all of our brains are neuroplastic. We're showing change at a chemical, a structural, and a functional level. And your brain is never at rest. And then together, that's going to support all of the change in your brain that you see and experience. So if our brain is so magnificently neuroplastic, why can't we learn anything we want with ease? I live in Canada. I cannot speak French. It's a terrible embarrassment. I've taken it. I've practiced it. I've lived in France. And I'm terrible. I just can't do it. Something about my brain doesn't enable me to learn French. So what is that? What's different about me that I can't do that? Or why sometimes do kids who are marvelous learners fail in school? And then lastly, really the focus of my research at UBC is why don't people fully recover after we damage the brain? And so these are questions that we ask in my lab. We try to understand what are the limits of neuroplasticity and what can we do to facilitate it? So first we're going to talk about some limits, and then I want to finish by talking about what we can do to facilitate learning and brain change. So firstly, as I mentioned before, not all neuroplastic change is positive. So you could have a repetitive use injury, chronic pain, drug and alcohol abuse, or kind of the thing that I'm betting has affected all of us and maybe is right now is stress and anxiety. So I want to talk just a little bit about stress and anxiety and what they do to our brain and how they limit our ability to learn. So when we're stressed, we release a hormone called cortisol. And this is a very normal thing, and it's a good thing, actually. So cortisol helps with lots of good things in our bodies. It helps regulate glucose, it regulates blood pressure, it helps us regulate our blood sugar, our immune function. It can help with inflammatory responses when we're hurt. And importantly, it helps us with arousal. So all of us woke up this morning because our our cortisol went up a little bit in our brain and it woke us up. And that's a very normal thing. And your cortisol maybe went up because you woke up naturally, or maybe because your phone alarm went off and scared you to death, which is how I woke up. And we get a spike in cortisol and we're awake. So these are good things. As we all know, if you're getting ready to take a test or run a race or do something that's kind of nervousy, a little bit of cortisol is good. Where we get into trouble with cortisol is when it goes high and it stays high for a really long time. So high and prolonged cortisol can have very negative effects on the body and on the brain. It can impair our cognition. It impairs our ability to sleep. It can suppress all kinds of things, thyroid function, blood sugar regulation. It decreases bone density and muscle. We can see increases in blood pressure. You can see lower immunity, but a higher inflammatory response. So that's quite negative. And it can change our cholesterol. So these are all things that we're not hopeful for. So what we think about now with cortisol and stress response is you want to have just the right amount. It's one of these things like a Goldilocks experiment, if you will. So you don't want to have too little cortisol. You can't wake up, you're not aroused. And you certainly don't want to have too much cortisol because then you have a lot of anxiety, memory impairments, health issues. So we want to have just the right amount of cortisol so it has positive effects on our memory, our immunity, and our pain sensitivity. Now, why am I talking so much about cortisol? So it turns out that in the brain, cortisol actually competes with another neurochemical that's really important for brain change. So we have these what are called growth factors in the brain, and they're chemicals that help our neurons to be more able to change. And the big one that we think a lot about is something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, or BDNF. And BDNF and cortisol actually compete for the same binding site. So you can think about it like this. If you have a parking lot and all the cars are parked in the spots, all the cars are parked with cortisol, your growth factor, your BDNF, doesn't have a place to park to affect that neuron. And so this is a real problem when you have high cortisol, you have low brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And what the net effect is then is if you're really stressed for a long and prolonged amount of time, it impairs your ability to learn, to form new memories, and to change your brain in a positive fashion. So it can actually limit learning. So then a really important question becomes, well, what do we do to reduce the amount of cortisol in our brain? Or what do we do to try to counteract that and have high amounts of these brain-derived neurotrophic factors so we can be really good learners? So what behaviors support learning, and in particular then also support our brain health, because we know that learning and brain health are very tightly linked to one another. And how does that, how's that affected with age? So I said I'd come back to it. So sleep. So all mammals sleep, and it's a really interesting scientific problem to think about. Why do we sleep? One, it's a phenomenal waste of time. We spend a third of our life asleep. That's a lot of time. Secondly, it's a very vulnerable time. You can think about it from an evolutionary perspective. Falling asleep out on the savannah, you could get eaten by a lion, right? You could be hurt by someone. It's dangerous. And so there must be something really, really important about sleep, the fact that we all do it. All of us do it. So what has become very clear is a few things about sleep. One is that it's critical for making new memories. So for taking that short-term memory and doing what we call consolidating it, making it into a long-term memory, we have to have sleep or it just doesn't happen. So for example, if sleep is blocked for even as many as 2 to 3 nights, people actually start to show signs of psychosis. And this has actually been used as a torture technique to just never let people sleep. We also see that when your sleep is disrupted or you don't sleep enough, we see very significant changes in capacity for learning, for capacity to form new memories, and actually also learn new movements. And then lastly, we know that sleep, or it's an emerging literature suggesting that sleep is really important for just brain health. So there's been a finding that people who don't sleep well are people who work at night, and don't have normal sleep patterns because they're trying to sleep during the day, that they actually have a significantly higher rate of cancer than people who are able to have sleep at night and have long and normal amounts of sleep. So there's some now new thinking around the importance of sleep, maybe a time when the brain actually cleanses itself of what are called free radicals, the byproducts of chemical transmissions in the brain. And this is really important for keeping the brain healthy and keeping the body healthy well into age. So we have this very kind of traditional sleep-wake cycle that's very important for the body. And I'm coming back to our friend cortisol that we talked about earlier, because cortisol and melatonin, which helps us sleep or has us sleep, they also cycle and are working opposite of one another. So early in the morning, our cortisol, which is here in blue, it goes up because we're waking up and the body naturally releases it. Our cortisol peaks early in the day and then slowly decreases all day. About the time that it gets dark, we'll start to express melatonin. Our melatonin will go up and peak, and then it will go down through the night, and we start again, we cycle again. Now, one of the things that's important about melatonin is that it is only released when our eye stops getting light into it. So we have this really beautiful, elegant circuit in a brain area called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. We think about it as our biological clock. And what's so interesting is when light is hitting our eye, it activates this area of the brain, the suprachiasmatic nucleus, and it stops the expression of melatonin. So if you're in light, it's really hard to go to sleep, right? We don't sleep as well. We may not be able to go to sleep unless it's actually dark. And that's because the circuit in our brain is actually being blocked and melatonin is not being released. Once it becomes dark, the circuit is turned on, our body releases melatonin, and we can actually go to sleep. So you've all heard a lot recently about problems with these guys, our phones, and being on them late at night, and always having light into our eyes, either from the room, from a phone, from a TV. And the issue there is that we're actually preventing the neurochemical that's going to help us sleep from being expressed. And so some of us are more or less sensitive to that, but that is a real issue for sleep and for memory formation and brain health. So we think that sleep is a really important circuit, or a really important facet of learning. This is because we see that if you put people in the MRI scanner and you scan their brains all night long, you see patterns reemerge when they're asleep that reflect what they had done that day. So if you run an experiment where someone practices something new or they try to learn something new, and you scan their brain and you see what the pattern of brain activity looks like while they're trying that new learning, and then you have them come back and they sleep in the MRI and you scan them all night, what you find is that in the nighttime, they're replaying that same brain activity that they did earlier in the task they were trying to learn. So this is called the replay hypothesis. And we think one of the main pieces of learning is we're almost re-practicing the skill we were trying to learn actually in our sleep. And the next day, then you see higher amounts of learning. So how much sleep do you actually need? Well, it's really variable from person to person. And so I'm sure there are some of you who can get away with sleeping 4 hours a night, and I'm really jealous because I'm not one of those people. I'm a flat out disaster if I don't sleep at least 7 hours. And so that's me, and I've learned that over time. And I know that if I can get 7 to 8 hours of sleep, I'll be a productive and kind human being. And if I get less than that, things get a little crunchy. But if you look at this list, we do need more. We do need a decent amount of sleep. Really, even as older adults, we need at least 7 hours of sleep probably. And if you look down here at kids, they really need a lot more sleep than they probably are getting. So I happen to have two 17-year-olds in my house, and I am confident that they are not getting 8 to 10 hours of sleep a night because they stay up a lot later than I can, and I don't know exactly when they're getting to sleep. But they're probably chronically sleep deprived. We think most of our kids actually are these days, especially even these younger kids where they're needing, 10, 12 hours a night of sleep, and that's not actually taking place. But for us in our brain health, we're looking at needing, somewhere between 7 to 8 hours of sleep a night. Okay, so I want to talk about exercise, because that's the second thing that we know really promotes brain health, really promotes learning as we age. So exercise does lots of things in the brain. It enhances blood flow. It causes us to have more blood vessel formation. We actually see healthier brain tissue in people who exercise versus people who don't. You see that neural growth factors, that brain-derived neurotrophic factor, is actually released as a byproduct of exercise. I'll come back to that in just a sec. And we see more neurotransmitters also in people who exercise. And now this is a neuron. These are two neurons down here. This is from a mouse, or two different mice. This is a mouse who was not exercising, and this is a mouse who was exercising. And you can just look to see that there's much more complexity and richness to the neuron of the mouse that exercised as compared to the one who didn't. And so this is just a nice example of how exercise, regular exercise, actually promotes this neural structure that's much healthier, much more elaborate. So in my lab, we've done lots of work on exercise. It's one of our foci. And we've been particularly interested in thinking about, could we use exercise to help people learn faster? So we think about exercise as being something that we can use to prepare the brain to learn. So the way that our experiments work is that we have people engage in a very high intensity, short bout of exercise. It's called HIIT training, high intensity interval training. They do 9 minutes at 90% of their maximal capacity. So it's very, very hard, but it's very short. And then they try to practice and learn something new. So I want to just show you two of our data slides here. And what they're trying to practice is to learn this sequence of movements. And there's times when they're learning a sequence of movements that repeats, and that can be learned. And there's time when they're learning a sequence of movements that's random, so they can't learn it. So we're just looking at how well can they control their arm. So in these experiments, I'll just orient you to this plot here. We have a group that exercised. They did that high intensity exercise. We have a group that just rested for the same amount of time. And then up is better. So that means that they're more efficient at performing this motor skill task. So they've exercised and they've practiced this task. So in a single session, if you exercise and you practice the task, you don't see any advantage for exercising. Remember I said up was better? Our exercise group is in black, our rest group is in gray, and there's no difference. This is for the sequence that they were learning, and there's no difference there. And there's also no difference for that random sequence that they were just performing that they couldn't actually practice. So if I'd stopped the experiment after this one day and said, does exercise have an effect on learning? I would have had to say no. However, what we do is we bring people back 24 hours later. We know that in that amount of time, they've done an important thing. They've slept. And so we bring folks back 24 hours later and we don't have them exercise. We just have them do the task. We just say, show us how good you are at this task after yesterday's practice. And when we do that, look at the exercise groups change. So the exercise group for the repeated sequence that they've learned shows a huge amount of change as compared to the group that just rested. And that's especially true for the sequence that they've learned. It's not true for just the movements that they've just performed, the random movements. So here we can really suggest that having exercised, practiced, and slept is a really critical recipe for learning something new. And so it suggests to us that it's not just the exercise, but exercise prepares the brain. We increase the release of brain-derived neurotrophic factor. We have the practice, make a short-term memory, go to sleep, we consolidate it, we make a long-term memory, and people are really good at it the next day. So we've shown similar findings in lots of different tasks in young people and older people, and also in people with stroke. And so we feel really confident that exercising while you're trying to learn something is a really good recipe for learning. We've also looked at brain, and so we also find that this combination of exercise and practice is really good for brain health. So we see kind of a whole system of patterns of change across the brain. So we see that the brain is more excitable on the side that, on one side, the side where we're making the movements from. We see the two hemispheres are not inhibiting each other, they're also more excitable. And we see less inhibition coming from a brain region called the cerebellum onto the cortex. So we see these whole brain changes, a neural environment that's ready to learn after we do these bouts of exercise. Okay, so I want to talk about one more thing. And that is, we've done a little bit of work looking at just mindset. So mindfulness, yoga, relaxation, and trying to understand how that facilitates learning. So I'm going to show you, I think, a very short video clip here, if that's okay. And I want to explain this experiment to you. So we put people in an MRI scanner and we induced different emotional states. So we induced happiness. We induced stress by showing a video clip actually from Schindler's List. It's a horrible video. I'm not going to show it to you. We also induced anger. So showing a different video clip from a movie called I Am Sam. And these have all been neuropsychologically validated to induce emotions. And we did this in people who regularly practiced yoga. And we did this in people who were recreational runners. So there were actually very fit people, the runners, but they didn't have these intentional times of life where they're practicing yoga and perhaps being mindful. So really quickly, I'm going to give you a little dopamine hit, because if this fails to make you happy, well, it's impossible. It can't. So this is our happy video. Okay, so they're very big videos, big emotional swing, very happy, very stressed, very angry. So what we did then is we looked to see if there was a difference between runners and people who do yoga in terms of how they react to the stressful video in particular. So we're looking at contrast here in the MRI. We can do this with something called heart rate variability. So our heart rate variability will be shifted by how stressed we are. And so for the first thing we found was that people who practiced yoga had a much more adaptive heart rate response to stress. So they didn't react. They didn't get this huge kind of stress flooding situation that was then reflected in their heart. The second thing that we found was a very different pattern of brain activity in the people with yoga as compared to the runners. So the people with yoga did not activate an old brain region called the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is a memory structure in the brain that we know is very affected by stress. It's the brain region that's affected when we have post-traumatic stress disorder. So we have a very strong emotional aversion to something, even an overwhelming emotional aversion to something. So if you've ever just lost it, completely lost it, had a full breakdown, really angry, really stressed, that was your amygdala. So the people who practice yoga, basically when we showed them the really stressful videos, did not react with their amygdala. It was almost like they observed the video, but they didn't have this huge emotional reaction. And so we were able to kind of conclude that by practicing yoga, by practicing mindfulness, they were likely just showing a more adaptive practiced response to these really stressful environments. And in doing so, they keep their cortisol lower, and they're probably more able then to turn around and show learning. So I have to tell you, I was really surprised by this study. I'm a runner, and I was in the recreational athletes group. And when we started off to design it, my graduate student designed it. And I really thought that the runners would turn out to have a better brain response and a better heart response. So I was surprised, which is the fun part of my job, is being surprised by data. But it suggests that there's a powerful effect, actually, that may be inferred by these other behaviors, such as yoga. So what's special about yoga? We don't actually really fully understand. We think that one of the things that's happening when people practice yoga is they're allowing the brain a time to revert to that resting state. So to go to that default mode network, so kind of shift back and calm itself down. And so we do understand that these now links between resting state and brain health are actually being studied. So one last thing I want to mention, there's a Netflix series now. I had this slide before the Netflix series, but you may have seen it, about the blue zones. If not, you might want to check it out. But I want to talk about these really quickly because they're instructive about how we can kind of create an environment around ourselves to optimize our brain health and our longevity. So there's these places in the world where people on average live to be over 100 years of age, and they're called the blue zones. And so worldwide life expectancy is just a little below 80. And then we have these very special regions where people live to be almost 20 years older. So what is special about those areas? So these are the areas: Loma Linda, California; Nicoya, Costa Rica; Sardinia, Italy, Ikara, Greece, and Okinawa, Japan. So there's been a lot of studies in these areas. We actually see, if you study the cellular health of people who live in these regions, their cellular clocks are running slower than the rest of ours. And so this may be one reason for their longevity. But if you look through and you say, what's different in these regions that's enabling people to live to be old and healthy, like they're living to old age, but very healthily doing so, there come out to be these 6 things that fall out that seem to be really important. They have very rich, intricate family structures, intergenerational families living together. Basically, none of them smoke. These are all areas where there's absolutely no nicotine smoking. They're semi-vegetarians. They don't eat only vegetarian food, but mostly fish if they're eating meat. There's a heavy consumption of legumes, of beans in the diet. Constant, moderate physical activity. These are places where people walk almost everywhere. So they're not running marathons. They're not doing my crazy high intensity interval training. They're getting constant, moderate activity to get from place to place. And they have heavy, heavy amounts of social engagement within the group. So very rich social networks. And so this is kind of emerging as almost a recipe, if you will, for thinking about longevity of, could you create an environment around yourself that takes advantage of these key issues and actually then enables you to live longer. And in looking at all of these issues, especially things like constant moderate physical activity, no smoking, social engagement, we know that those are issues that greatly facilitate neuroplastic change and learning well into old age. So just in summary then, I hope you take away from today that your brain is highly neuroplastic. So you've changed it. It's totally different now than it was when we started. And that it's your behavior that's shaping that change. So you can choose how you want your brain to change and in what way, by the behaviors you engage in, by the people you interact with, by what you consume. And this ability remains throughout life. So it's not something that falls off as we become older. So neuroplasticity can be positive or negative, depending on how we're changing our brain, what our environment is, what's happening to us. But remember that brain change is most significantly affected by your behavior. So you can change your brain. And with that, I'm happy to take your questions. This is not what the University of British Columbia looks like today. We have 2 feet of snow with heavy rain on top of it. So hence I am joining you from my home because I'm afraid to go outside. But if you're ever in the neighborhood, if you're in Vancouver, feel free to reach out and come and see my lab and or our very beautiful campus. So thank you for inviting me today.
Dr. Boyd, thank you so much. That was phenomenal. And we do have a lot of questions here in the chat, and I'll just start them off. So one question we have is, should someone get an MRI on a regular basis? Example, as part of their yearly physical?
Yeah, probably not. There's probably really no reason. It's neat. I mean, it'd be really fun to have one, and I scan myself regularly as a part of my research. But if you don't have any reason to be concerned, there's probably no reason to take the time and the money to do so. If you're just super interested and you'd love to see your brain and understand more about it, then I would suggest you find a research program at a local university and find a study you can enroll in. So you're both helping advance science and getting to learn a bit about your brain in the process.
Got it. Thanks. I see Ravi has their hand raised. Ravi, if you wanted to unmute and ask your question.
So I've heard that doing a lot of mental exercises are good for you. And I've been doing Sudoku for a long time, and I've become good at it. But then I also read that if you have become good at it, you need to change to a different exercise rather than continuing with the same one. Is that true? And 2, what would you recommend as other exercises?
Sure. Yeah, it's a wonderful question. So first of all, kudos to you if you've broken Sudoku and it's no longer hard, because that hasn't happened to me yet, and I like to do it. So you want to always be challenging your brain. And I didn't show data about this today, but we have a lot of data in my lab showing that when we're challenging ourselves is when we're stimulating the most amount of neuroplasticity. So actually, when you're learning, struggle is quite good for your brain. You can think about it this way. If something's not hard, you have plenty of brain to do the task, and you don't need to change your brain. If something's too hard, you just simply can't change your brain because you can't do it. So what you want to do is make things optimally difficult so you can do it, but it's not easy. So if you've broken Sudoku and it's no longer a challenge at all, you probably do want to incorporate another kind of task or skill or challenging puzzle that you might enjoy. So you can shift to the New York Times crossword puzzle, and Godspeed if you can do the Sunday one, right? So yeah, it's a really important point about challenge being important.
Thank you.
I see you've got some hands raised, but we did have some questions posted in the chat earlier, so I want to get through some of them. One person asked, have you ever been involved with any study that looked at the effect of meditation on the brain?
So I haven't done meditation studies, but my close colleague and good friend has. So this would be Kim Schonert-Reichel, who is now at the University of Chicago. And her work is focused very much on understanding meditation and mindfulness, both in adults and in also in children. And so in particular, that work shows that a short mindfulness practice every day of about 3 times 3 minutes, so again, 9 minutes a day, is really healthy for brain. It reduces the amount of cortisol. It improves learning, optimism, sense of self, improves conflict resolution. So generally, it's a very, very positive type of health behavior to engage in.
Got it. Thank you. I'm seeing our center in New York has a question. If you want to unmute and ask.
Yes, my question has to do with the issue of dementia, and I was watching this segment on 60 Minutes about this doctor who's a brain surgeon, and he said that he doesn't really see anymore any need for surgery on the brain, and he said that, from my understanding, that using ultrasound is better in detecting problems with the brain and dementia than actually having surgery. And I need to know what's your thoughts on that. And just one other very quickly. Elon Musk has come up with this Neuralink, and just looking at it from, of course, the internet, and as a doctor who knows about the brain, what's your understanding of what that is?
Sure. Yeah. So let me start with the ultrasound question first. It's really important to think about this one. So we now have a new tool called focused ultrasound, where we can drive ultrasonic pulses into the brain and interact with brain structures doing that. It's a really exciting research tool, and there's a few early reports that you can actually use it when we become demented. If we have Alzheimer's type dementia, because there's different kinds of dementia. So if we have Alzheimer's, our brain, those neurons I showed you, those beautiful neurons, they become tangled. They get misaligned for some reason in dementia. And so there's a new report out that you can use this ultrasound to break up those tangles, and that it actually may benefit cognition. So it's really exciting, but it's really new. Like those data they're maybe 3 months old. So I think we need more information. I think it's exciting. It's a thrilling development. It would be thrilling to have a decent intervention for dementia. And honestly, there's nothing in health that I think would be more important than developing that right now. But I don't think we're quite there. So watch, as I said, watch the space. It's changing fast. I'd keep an eye on that one. And hopefully it continues to work, because it's going to need to be replicated. Different centers, different populations, different levels of dementia. And so that work is happening, and it's exciting that that's out there. Elon Musk. I just, in full disclosure, I have deleted my Twitter account because I just couldn't. Neuralink is a really interesting idea. So it's this idea that Elon has had, that you can do something called a brain-computer interface, so that we could start to implant computers into our brains to make ourselves these crazy learning machines. To date, it has not been successful. and where the most effort in the field, I'm going to put Elon in a box, where the most effort in the field has gone is in trying to use a brain-computer interface to help, for example, people with severe spinal cord injury and paralysis to walk again. So could you kind of rewire the spinal cord, or could you rewire parts of the brain with a computer to enable the return of function? There's a lot of problems with that. The biggest one is we don't really know how the brain works. So we can't really reprogram it because we don't know what we're reprogramming. So we don't have the basic work. The other just really practical problem that we have is that the brain is really protective of its neurons. And so if you insert something into the brain, an electrode, for example, it works for a short amount of time, and then the brain forms scar tissue around it. So it's trying to protect itself from an infection. And so the implant will stop to work because it's scarred off and it just can't communicate. So that's been their major problem that they really haven't been able to address. In addition to all of, I would raise to you ethical problems. Do you want a computer hardwired in your brain? Is that like a good idea? I don't know. That's a neuroethicist, but there's some big issues around Neuralink. It's why you don't hear much about it when they talk about Elon's companies, right? You hear about SpaceX and Tesla and Twitter.
Thank you.
So I'm skeptical, but we'll see.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dr. Boyd. We have enough time for about 2 more questions. Jane Stone, I see you have your hand raised if you want to unmute and ask your question. Jane, you're still muted. I'm not sure if you're speaking, but there we go.
Okay, sorry, it wouldn't let me unmute there for a while. So I teach piano to adults who have never studied any music before. And I'm wondering, in light of what you've told us about neuroplasticity and all of that, why it takes so much longer than it takes a child to learn the skills. But it's very complex, but I just wondered how that meshes with what you've told us about we can learn anything and we have this neuroplasticity.
Right. So this is that what limits and what facilitates neuroplasticity. So we can learn it. We're just a lot slower as we age, especially when you think about something as motorically complex as piano. So one of the reasons for that is that our brains are actually not mature and fully wired up, if you will, until we're about 25 years of age. So we used to think, you were an adult at what, 18? And maybe your body is, but your brain certainly isn't. So brain maturity happens at 25. So if you're teaching piano to someone who's less than 25, you can actually influence how the brain is maturing, and you can actually kind of help them to hardwire in those skills by facilitating neuroplasticity on a developing brain. So you just have more plastic capacity. Once we turn 25, or when we kind of finish maturing our brains, there's some averages around that. Girls are actually probably brain mature around 22 or 23. Boys are more close to 25. Once we pass that time frame and we do have a mature brain, we're still able to change it. It's just much slower, much more effortful. It probably takes more practice.
And why is that? I mean,
it's because their brain is we've now finished the maturing. So when the brain's immature, you can actually influence its maturity with practice. So you can influence how much connectivity is happening between brain regions because they're not fully connected. When we're older, they are fully connected. Now you have to reverse it rather than change how it's growing. If that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you almost have to undo and then redo as you're learning as an adult.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Boyd. Just one more question from the chat. Can you ask your doctor for a cortisol test?
You can if you want. Cortisol, it shifts through the day quite a bit, so you'd have to think about what time. Cortisol is really easy to measure. You can just swab the inside of your cheek, and it's in our saliva, and then you can measure it out and see. So that's one way to do. That's how we would do this experimentally. I think the other way, there's such a strong relationship between cortisol and stress. You could also just give yourself a test of stress. Or if you have a device like an Apple Watch or a Garmin watch, they will actually show you your heart rate variability as a measure of stress. And they're actually very, very accurate. So you can feel free to use one of those tools to actually look at your stress through the day and kind of track it and see how you're doing. And if you do that, let's say you get it, I'm not advocating Apple Watch. I just know they have this function because my daughter has one and I was playing with it. So you have one of these devices and you wear it to sleep as well as through the day for a week or so. You'll get to see that relationship between how well you slept and what your stress level is in terms of your heart rate variability. You can kind of start to track yourself and see, okay, this week I was really stressed. This week I did yoga, or I saw my family, or I got a nice exercise in, and you can see how these things are shifting with your other behaviors. So you do a little experiment on yourself. That'd be fun.
Well, that's all the time that we have for questions in this segment. Dr. Boyd, thank you so much for the wonderful information that you shared and for taking the time to answer our participants' questions.